The gun pressed against the back of her skull was still warm from the last time it fired. Aurora Kingsley had built an empire worth $11 billion on the principle that she could read any room, any person, any situation faster than anyone else in it. Tonight, surrounded by Manhattan's most powerful people, with crystal chandeliers trembling from the force of the doors being kicked open, she understood with absolute clarity that none of that mattered anymore. Three masked men with automatic weapons had turned the most exclusive restaurant in the city into a killing ground in under 60 seconds. And the only person in the room who didn't look afraid, the only one whose hands stayed still, whose breathing stayed even, whose eyes tracked those gunmen with something that felt disturbingly like patience, was a man in a faded plaid shirt sitting at a corner table with a little girl wearing a paper birthday crown. Aurora had noticed him earlier and dismissed him in under 3 seconds. She would spend the rest of her life rethinking those 3 seconds. If this story already has you holding your breath, you're exactly where we want you. Subscribe to our channel and follow this story all the way to the end, because what happens next will stay with you long after the screen goes dark. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling us your city and country. We want to see how far this story travels. Now let's go back to that restaurant. Let's go back to that man in the plaid shirt. And let's start from the beginning. The reservation had taken Damian Cole 3 weeks to secure. He wasn't the kind of man restaurants like Aurelius kept on any kind of preferred list. He drove a 12-year-old Ford pickup that leaked oil on cold mornings and made a grinding sound on left turns that he kept meaning to fix. He owned 4 dress shirts, 2 of them technically his late wife's favorites, which he still hung separately from everything else. And the plaid one he wore tonight was the best of the 4, which wasn't saying much. His hands were permanently stained around the knuckles from years of engine grease that soap couldn't fully reach. He was 37 years old, and he looked it. But Emma had seen a photo of Aurelius's dining room in a magazine someone had left in the waiting area at her pediatrician's office. She'd torn it out carefully and taped it to her bedroom wall without saying anything about it for 6 months. Damian had found it one evening while he was putting laundry away, and he'd stood there in her doorway looking at that picture for a long time. So he'd called. He'd been put on a waiting list. He'd called again. He'd been told politely that the waiting list was quite long. He'd called a 3rd time, explained it was his daughter's 8th birthday, and the woman on the phone, after a pause that suggested she was consulting with someone, had found him a corner table for 2 on a Thursday evening in October. He'd spent more on Emma's birthday dress than he'd spent on groceries that month. He didn't tell her that. "Dad?" Emma pressed her nose against the glass panel beside the entrance, her breath fogging it up. She was wearing a white dress with small yellow flowers on it, and her hair was in 2 braids because that was how she always wore it, fancy occasion or not. The paper birthday crown, gold, with plastic gemstones, sat slightly crooked on her head. She'd made it herself at school. "Dad, there's a chandelier in there." "There's probably more than one." "How many?" "Let's count them when we get inside." She counted 4 before the hostess had finished walking them to their table. She reported this to Damian in a whisper as they sat down, as if she'd discovered something important that needed to be officially logged. 4, he confirmed. Good counting. The corner table was small and slightly removed from the main floor, which Damian suspected was intentional. Their reservation had probably been a minor inconvenience to whoever managed seating. It didn't bother him. He'd spent enough years in environments where being overlooked was a tactical advantage to feel anything but comfortable in a corner with his back to the wall and a clear sightline to the room. That was the thing about 17 years of military conditioning. It didn't come with an off switch. Emma was studying the menu with the focused intensity she brought to everything that interested her. She'd inherited that from her mother, that quality of going completely still when something captured her attention, like the rest of the world could wait. Damian watched her trace a finger down the page, mouthing words she didn't recognize. "What's duck confit?" "Duck that's been cooked slowly in its own fat." She made a face. "In its own fat? It's actually really good." "That's gross, Dad. You literally ate a gas station hot dog last week and asked for 2. That's different." "How is that different?" She considered this with the gravity of someone ruling on a close legal case. The hot dog didn't cook in its own anything. He laughed, and it surprised him the way it always surprised him. The way real laughter still caught him off guard sometimes, like a sound he'd forgotten his body knew how to make. The room around them was exactly what it was supposed to be. Wealth arranged to look effortless. Women in gowns that cost more than his truck. Men in suits that had been fitted and refitted until they sat like a second skin. Soft conversation, the quiet percussion of silverware on good china, someone's low laugh from across the room. A sommelier gliding between tables with the practiced invisibility of long experience. Damien clocked all of it without appearing to look at any of it. Old habit. He'd stopped apologizing to himself for it years ago. He noticed the woman at the large center table because it was difficult not to. Not because of the gown, though the gown was the deep blue of a sky an hour after sunset and clearly designed to be noticed. Not because of the jewelry or the way 3 separate people had stopped by her table in the 20 minutes since Damien had sat down, each one adopting a slightly more deferential posture than the last. He noticed her because she was the most alert person in the room apart from himself. Her eyes moved the same way his did, cataloging, processing, even when she appeared to be doing something else. Even when she was laughing at something one of her companions said, some part of her was still watching the door. He recognized that quality. He'd seen it in people who'd learned to stay careful. He looked away and went back to helping Emma decide between 2 desserts she wanted to order at the same time. "Pick one," he said. "But what if the other one is better?" "That's always the risk." "That's not helpful, Dad." "Emma." "Fine." She pointed at the menu. "The chocolate one. But if it's bad, you have to share yours." "I'm not ordering dessert." Her expression suggested this was a personal failing on his part. He was opening his mouth to explain the economics of restaurant pricing when the front doors of Aurelius came off their hinges. Not literally, but it felt that way. 3 men in black tactical masks, moving in the tight coordinated formation of people who had practiced this exact sequence, pushed through the entrance at speed, and the first thing they did was fire 2 shots into the ceiling plasterwork above the hostess stand. The sound in a room like that was enormous. Screaming, chairs scraping, a glass shattering somewhere. Someone near the windows stood up and immediately sat back down when one of the men swung his weapon in that direction. The room collapsed from elegance to chaos in the span of 4 seconds, and the 3 men let it happen, let the panic crest and break, because panicked people were manageable people. That was the calculation, and it was correct. Damien had Emma's wrist in his hand before the second shot finished echoing. "Down," he said. Not loud, just the word, in the tone that Emma knew meant now, and not in a moment, and not after you ask why. She went down, slipping off her chair onto the floor, and he crouched beside her, positioning himself between her and the center of the room, his free hand gripping the chair beside him, not to hide, but to brace. "Dad, I'm right here. Don't talk. Keep your head down." She was scared. He could feel it in how hard she was squeezing his hand, but she wasn't making noise, which meant she was trusting him, and he was not going to let that trust become the wrong decision. He scanned the room from his low position, moving only his eyes. 3 men, one near the entrance, blocking exit, covering the widest sight line, one moving toward the center of the floor, asserting control of the largest cluster of guests. The third was circling toward the periphery, which meant he was either checking for threats or looking for something specific. Their weapons were MP5 variants, suppressed. Tactical vests, but lighter than military. Fast movers, not expecting sustained engagement. They moved with confidence that came from planning, not from combat experience. He could tell the difference. Professional enough to be dangerous, not professional enough to be the thing he'd actually been trained to fight. The man covering the center of the room, the one giving directions, which made him the lead, had a voice that carried without effort. "Nobody leaves. Nobody calls. Sit on the floor where I can see your hands." People obeyed. The room settled into a terrible, breathless compliance. Damien put his back against the wall and kept Emma pressed close to him, and he watched. He watched the way the lead man's eyes kept returning to the center table. He watched the third man complete his circuit and exchange a glance with the leader that confirmed something. He watched Aurora Kingsley, who had not gone to the floor. She was still seated, her hands flat on the table, her face perfectly composed except for a tightness around her eyes that she couldn't quite control. She knew why they were here. That much was clear to Damien within the first 90 seconds. This wasn't a robbery. The way they moved, what they were scanning for, they'd come for a specific person. "Happy birthday," Emma breathed against his shoulder very quietly. He couldn't tell if it was a question or not. "Yeah, baby," he said, just as quietly. "We're going to be okay." He believed it. That was the strange part. He genuinely believed it, not as a comfort he was performing for her benefit, but as an assessment. The room was bad, the situation was dangerous, but it was readable. It had edges, and anything with edges could be worked. The lead gunman's name, as Damien would learn later from the police report, was Vincent Caro, former private security contractor, currently employed by people who had specific financial grievances against Kingsley Global and had decided that leverage was worth more than legality. He was 34 years old, smart in a narrow and overconfident way, and he'd chosen the restaurant precisely because its clientele made them reluctant hostages, wealthy enough to be valuable, privileged enough to be psychologically unprepared for actual violence. He knew his target the moment he walked in. Aurora Kingsley sat at her table and made no effort to pretend otherwise. Caro walked toward her slowly, and the room watched him the way rooms watch things they cannot stop. "Ms. Kingsley," he said her name like he'd been saving it. "You're going to make some phone calls for us tonight." "I'm going to do nothing for you," Aurora said. The evenness in her voice surprised even Damien, and he'd already revised his first assessment of her twice. Caro's jaw shifted. He hadn't expected that, or rather he'd expected it less than he'd planned for. "You're going to want to reconsider that." "You came into this restaurant to intimidate me," she said. "If you intended to shoot me, I'd already be shot. So the weapon is theater, which means you need something from me alive, which means I have more options than you're pretending I have." She was right, and the fact that she'd worked that out in 60 seconds of active terror said a great deal about how she'd built an $11 billion company. It also made Caro angry, which was the problem with being right at the wrong time. He stepped forward and grabbed her arm, pulling her upright from the chair, and there was a sound from across the room. A single, involuntary sound from a man who'd been silent for the past several minutes. But it wasn't protest, and it wasn't fear. It was the sound of something clicking into place. Caro turned. At his corner table, the man in the faded plaid shirt was watching him. Not with anger. Not with the wired-up, adrenaline-sick expression of someone trying to make themselves brave. He was watching Caro with an expression that was almost clinical. The way a person looks at a problem they've already halfway solved but haven't moved on yet because the timing isn't right. Caro didn't like it. He couldn't have said why. He'd walked into rooms full of frightened, armed men and not felt what he felt looking at this unremarkable mechanic in a corner booth with a little girl in a paper crown. He decided to address it because men like Caro always made that mistake. "Hey," he pointed. "What are you looking at?" Damien didn't answer. "I'm talking to you, the guy with the wrench monkey hands." A few people flinched at the tone. Caro walked 2 steps closer, dragging Aurora with him. "What, you think you're going to do something? You and your little brat over there?" His voice carried across the silent room. He wanted the room to hear it. He wanted the room to see this, the nobody mechanic in the cheap shirt sitting still while a man with a gun reminded him of his place. It was a kind of theater, too, a cruelty with an audience. "I've seen 1,000 guys like you. You're going to sit right there and not make a sound and be grateful your kid doesn't—" "Emma," Damien said quietly, interrupting nothing because Caro hadn't finished. "Close your eyes and count backward from 100. "Okay," Emma said immediately. She pressed her face against his arm and began counting in a murmur. Caro opened his mouth to finish his sentence, and one of his men, the one working the room's north edge, stepped around the end of the corner table and reached toward Emma, not to hurt her, just to grab and use, just leverage, just control, just another piece of the theater, and his hand got within 8 inches of her shoulder. 8 inches! Damien had told himself on the drive over, while Emma chattered about chandeliers and whether ducks deserved to be eaten, that tonight was just a birthday dinner, that he was just a mechanic and a dad, that the version of himself who had moved through darkness in 4 countries over 7 years was someone else who wore a different face and answered to different rules, someone he'd retired with full intention and no regret. He had really meant that. 8 inches. The table went sideways, the chair went back, and Damien Cole came up off the floor, and everything changed. The mechanic moved in a way that the room could not process in real time. Later, several of the witnesses would describe it in almost identical terms. Not as something fast, but as something wrong. something that violated the casual understanding of what a body could do, how quickly a decision could become an action, how many separate things a single person could control at once. In 2 seconds, witnesses counted afterward, trying to reconstruct it. Damien had removed the gunman's hand from Emma's vicinity, redirected his weapon arm, and broken something in his elbow with a sound that was very quiet and very final. The man sat down hard on the floor. He didn't get up. Damien had the weapon. Caro swung around, pulling Aurora in front of him. The second man near the entrance started moving, and Damien tracked both of them simultaneously, which should not have been possible for a mechanic from Queens, and yet... "Put it down," Caro said, voice gone thin. "No," Damien said, "I will shoot her." "If you were going to shoot her, you'd have done it when I moved." He took one step, angling his body so that the center of the room was to his left, and the remaining threat vectors were sorted into something manageable. "You need her walking and talking. That's why you're here." Another step. "You're running out of time because those shots you fired into the ceiling already have someone's phone to someone's ear, and we are going to hear sirens in approximately 4 minutes. Caro stared at him. "Who are you?" It came out almost involuntarily. Damien didn't answer that. He looked at Aurora. "When I tell you to drop, drop. Don't ask why, don't hesitate. Just go to the floor." She looked at him with an expression he couldn't fully read. Not fear, not quite trust, something still being decided. "Okay," she said, and she meant it. He could tell she meant it. He turned his attention back to Caro and to the man near the entrance, and the room held its breath, and Emma kept counting backward from 100 in a murmur against the wall, her eyes closed, her paper crown slightly crooked, her voice unwavering, the same way her father had taught her. Just keep going, one number at a time, stay in the count until someone tells you it's done. She was at 63 when the next thing happened, but that belongs to what comes after. What mattered in that corner of the room, in those last seconds before everything broke open, was a smaller thing. A thing that Aurora Kingsley would carry with her long after the police tape came down, and the news trucks left and the restaurant reopened, and the world moved on to the next story. She looked at the man who had stepped between her and a loaded weapon, this nobody from nowhere in a plaid shirt with grease under his fingernails, and a daughter counting backward with her eyes closed, and she thought, "I looked at him, and I saw nothing. I looked at him, and I saw nothing at all." She had never in her life been so wrong about anything. Emma was at 63. Damien registered that in the background of his attention, the way he registered everything. His daughter's voice, low and steady, counting backward in the dark behind her closed eyes, trusting him the way she'd been trusting him her whole life, which was the thing he could not afford to think about right now and could also not afford to forget. Caro had Aurora. The man near the entrance, the second one still standing, had shifted his position when Damien moved, which told him something. The shift was lateral, not forward. That was a man who didn't want to close the distance. That was a man whose confidence lived in the weapon and not in himself. Damien filed that away and kept his eyes on Caro, because Caro was the decision maker, and decision makers were where the situation either opened or sealed shut. "Last time," Caro said. His voice had found a harder register, scraping up from somewhere below his chest. He had Aurora's arm cranked up behind her back now, which meant he was uncomfortable. Uncomfortable people escalated. "Put the weapon down or I start making choices you're not going to like." "You've already made all your choices for tonight," Damien said. "You just haven't figured that out yet." He was watching Caro's grip on Aurora's arm, watching the angle of the pistol barrel, watching the way Caro's weight was distributed, slightly forward, which meant he was used to leaning into resistance, which meant he'd overcorrect if the resistance suddenly disappeared. "Who are you supposed to be?" Caro said. "Seriously, look at you." Damien didn't look at himself. He kept his eyes where they needed to be. "You think you're some kind of hero? You think this is a movie?" Caro's mouth did something that wasn't quite a smile. "I've put down better men than you on worse nights than this. You're a mechanic with my colleague's gun and a lucky first move. That's it. That's all you are." The room was listening. 40-something people pressed against walls and crouched under tables, and every one of them was waiting to find out if the man in the plaid shirt was what Caro said he was, or something else. Damien could feel it. The collective suspension of judgment, the room holding its verdict. He didn't perform for rooms. He never had. "Step to your left," he said to Aurora. his voice exactly the same as it had been. Calm in the way that still water is calm, not because nothing is moving, but because everything moving is below the surface. "Don't," Caro said, tightening his grip. Aurora's jaw was set. She was looking at Damien the way you look at a road you're not sure about, not unwilling to take it, just wanting to understand it first. Her left shoulder was up around her ear from the pressure on her arm. There was a small cut above her eyebrow from when Caro had initially grabbed her, probably from the edge of her own ring catching skin in the struggle. She hadn't mentioned it, hadn't touched it. "You okay?" Damien asked her, which was not the question she expected. She blinked. "I've had better Thursday evenings." "Fair enough. Could you maybe resolve this before it gets worse?" "Working on it." Caro made a sound of disbelief. Are you seriously having a conversation right now, while I'm standing here?" He yanked Aurora backward a step. "This is not negotiation. This is not a standoff where you talk me down. You're going to drop that weapon, and she's going to make a phone call, and then everyone in this room gets to go home and be grateful." "The phone call," Damien said. "That's what this is about." Caro didn't answer, which was its own answer. "Fund transfer," Damien said. "Not a question. You need authorization from her directly, something biometric or a sequence only she knows, or both." He watched Caro's face confirm it without meaning to. "How much?" "None of your business." "Ballpark." "Drop the gun." Damien exhaled through his nose. Over Caro's shoulder, through the restaurant's tall front windows, he could see the first thin suggestion of red and blue light starting to pulse against the buildings on the opposite side of the street. 4 minutes had been optimistic. It had been closer to 3. So had the second gunman near the entrance. The man had been drifting, not toward Damien, but toward the windows, and now Damien understood why. He'd seen the lights too, and he was recalculating whether he was in a robbery or an arrest, and those were two very different nights. "Your man by the door is about to run," Damien said to Caro. Caro turned his head, just slightly, just enough, and Damien moved. He didn't go for Caro, not directly. He went left, sharp and low, putting a cluster of upturned chairs between himself and the entrance man's firing line, closing the angle on Caro simultaneously, and he spoke one word at the same volume as everything else he'd said all night. "Drop." Aurora dropped. She went straight down, her knees hitting the floor, and Caro's grip came off her because she'd gone the direction he wasn't prepared for. Down, not back, not sideways, down. And for half a second he was holding nothing, and the pistol was pointed at empty air. Half a second was not a short amount of time. Damien came up inside Caro's reach, controlled the gun hand at the wrist, rotated, and the weapon came free. He put Caro against the nearest table with enough force to rattle the silverware and held him there with one forearm across the back of his shoulders. "Stay down," he said to Aurora, without looking at her. "I am down," she said from the floor. "I'm very down. I'm extremely down." He sat down on the floor next to her, which was probably not dignified, and he put his arm around her and she leaned into him, and he let out a breath that had been sitting in his chest for the better part of the last 10 minutes. "We'll see if the kitchen's still open," he said. "It has to be open. It's my birthday." "That's a compelling argument." She made a sound against his shoulder that was almost a laugh, and then she held on tighter, and he let her, and neither of them said anything else for a while. It was Aurora Kingsley, standing 10 feet away with a police officer trying to attend to the cut above her eyebrow, and not entirely succeeding because she kept moving her head, who watched all of this and felt something she could not immediately name. It was not sentiment. She didn't think of herself as a sentimental woman, and she had good evidence for that position. It wasn't pity. There was nothing pitiable about what she was looking at. It was something more like the specific discomfort of having a measurement you trusted turn out to be wrong in a way that called every other measurement into question. She'd looked at that man in the corner booth and seen nothing worth noticing. She was still working out what that meant about her. The officer beside her, young, female, patient, said, "Ms. Kingsley, I really do need you to hold still." "I'm holding still." "You're really not." Aurora held still. The paramedics arrived 8 minutes after the police, which in Midtown Manhattan on a Thursday night was genuinely good time, and the restaurant transformed from a crime scene into something that felt like the aftermath of a very intense and poorly organized cocktail party. People sat on the floor or in overturned chairs, wrapped in emergency blankets they mostly didn't need, giving statements to officers with tablets who moved through the room with the systematic efficiency of people doing a very familiar job in a very unfamiliar environment. Damien refused the emergency blanket they offered him. He accepted the cup of water because Emma wanted one, and he didn't want her to feel like she was the only one who needed it. They sat in the corner while a detective named Ruiz, mid-50s, reading glasses on a chain around his neck, the quietly exhausted manner of someone in the third decade of a job that had never stopped being exactly as strange as it had been on day one, asked Damien the same question 6 different ways. What was his name? Where was he from? What was his relationship to anyone in the room? What had made him move when he did? Had he had any prior knowledge of the perpetrators? Was he aware that discharging a firearm within city limits, even a recovered firearm in a defensive situation, was technically, and Ruiz waved his hand in a way that suggested this was a bureaucratic formality he personally found tedious, technically something that would need to be processed. Understood, Damien said. Can I ask what you do for a living, Mr. Cole? I'm a mechanic. I have a shop in Queens. Ruiz wrote this down. He looked up. He looked at Damien the same way Caro had looked at him, but without the malice. Just the same unresolvable gap between what was being said and what was being seen. And prior to the shop? A pause, not a long one. Military. Branch? Navy. Long service? Long enough. Ruiz studied him for a moment. He didn't push it. In Damien's experience, the detectives who had their own service time were the ones who knew not to push it, and something in Ruiz's posture suggested he was one of those. He clicked his pen and made a note. We're going to need you to come in tomorrow. Give a formal statement, standard for a situation like this. I know. You've done this before. Not quite a question. I've given statements before. Ruiz nodded slowly, accepting that as the answer it was. He looked at Emma, who was drawing on a paper napkin with a pen she'd apparently borrowed from someone without Damien noticing. Your daughter doing okay? She's pretty resilient. Kids usually are, Ruiz said. It's the parents who come apart. He said it without judgment, observationally. You holding up? Yeah. Okay. Ruiz stood, tucking his notebook back into his jacket. He started to move away and then paused. He looked back at Damien with the expression of someone filing something away. The move you made, taking down Caro's man before you went for Caro himself. Neutralizing the immediate physical threat to the kid first, then controlling the principal. That's a sequence. He said it carefully. That's a trained sequence. Damien didn't say anything. Ruiz nodded like that was also an answer. Get some sleep, Mr. Cole. We'll see you tomorrow. Across the room, Aurora was watching. She'd been watching on and off since the officers arrived, in the spaces between answering questions of her own and calling her assistant and reassuring the 3 people from her table who were cycling through various stages of post-adrenaline collapse. She was good at watching people without appearing to. She'd built a company partly on that skill, and what she was watching now was the kind of thing that she didn't have a category for, which bothered her in a way she recognized as important. The man had moved through a live hostage situation involving 3 armed individuals and disarmed 2 of them in under 4 minutes. He'd tracked multiple threat vectors simultaneously. He'd given clear, functional instructions under pressure, and she had, without fully deciding to, followed them, which was not something Aurora Kingsley did easily or often. And then he'd sat down on the floor of a wrecked restaurant and held his daughter and talked about chocolate dessert. Who did that? Her head of security, Marcus Tate, who had been the first person from her team she'd called, who was currently outside coordinating with the officers, and probably also having a difficult internal conversation about the fact that he'd been at a dinner across town when all of this happened, would have wanted to be the one to handle Caro. She knew that about him. He was good at his job, and his job was what defined him, and he would spend weeks reviewing this night, looking for the thing he could have done differently. That was Marcus's nature. The man in the plaid shirt had no such investment. He'd handled it and put it down and gone back to his daughter, and the gap between those 2 things, the handling and the putting down, had been immediate and complete. That was not something you learned in a gym. Her assistant, Priya, had arrived in the restaurant's side entrance 12 minutes after Aurora's call and was now at her elbow with a change of shoes. Aurora had lost 1 heel in the initial chaos. A phone charger. a bottle of sparkling water, and the expression of someone who had prepared for emergencies so many times that she'd quietly absorbed some of the calm that preparation was supposed to create. "The car's outside," Priya said. "Tate wants you to come out whenever you're ready." In a minute, Priya followed Aurora's eye line across the room. "Who is that?" "I'm trying to figure that out." "Should I—" "No." Aurora picked up her sparkling water. "Not tonight." She watched Damien lift Emma's paper crown from the floor where it had fallen. Somehow it had come off during everything, and set it back on his daughter's head, adjusting it slightly, the same way you'd straighten a picture frame, except gentler. Emma didn't look up from whatever she was drawing. She just reached up and touched it with 2 fingers, confirming it was back, and went back to her drawing. It was such a small thing, a paper crown with plastic gemstones. It probably cost 40 cents to make. Aurora had spent $4,000 on the floral arrangement at her table tonight, which was currently scattered across the floor in 3 separate locations. She drank her water and looked at the crown and felt the particular discomfort of a person whose internal accounting system was giving her results she hadn't expected. "Priya," she said. "Yes?" "Find out who he is." Priya looked at Damien again. At the plaid shirt, the grease-stained hands, the paper crown he'd just straightened. "The mechanic?" "His name is Damien Cole. He has a shop in Queens. He's ex-military. Navy." She paused. "And be quiet about it. I don't want it to look like—" She stopped again, because she wasn't entirely sure how to finish that sentence in a way she was comfortable with. "Just be professional about it." "I'm always professional." "I know you are. That's why I'm telling you." Priya made a note and tucked her phone back in her jacket, and the two of them stood there for another moment watching the room settle, watching the officers work, watching the restaurant staff reappear from the kitchen in 1s and 2s with the cautious expressions of people who'd spent the last 30 minutes hiding behind industrial refrigerators and were not entirely sure the coast was clear. The head chef, a tall, deeply unhappy-looking man named Gerard, whom the restaurant manager seemed to be trying to manage simultaneously with everything else, appeared in the kitchen doorway, looked at what remained of his dining room, and said something in French that did not require translation. It was Aurora's assistant who later told her that the kitchen had technically remained open throughout, that the pastry station had continued functioning, that at some point during the police response, 2 desserts had been quietly delivered to the corner table, 1 chocolate, 1 lemon, on the house, without anyone formally requesting them, which was either a liability decision or a human decision or some combination of the two that probably couldn't be fully separated. The little girl ate the chocolate one. Her father watched her eat it with the expression of a man who had decided that this was the only thing that mattered right now and was right. Aurora was told about this later and didn't say anything in response. She had a reputation for not being easy to read, and most people in her company took her silences as a kind of approval-pending state, something that would resolve itself into a decision when enough data arrived. Priya, who had worked for her for 6 years and knew better than most what Aurora's silences actually meant, simply made a note and went on to the next item. But she noticed. Over the next 2 days, while the news broke and expanded and took on the particular velocity that New York City stories achieve when they contain enough of the right elements, wealth, danger, an unlikely hero, a child in a paper crown, Aurora received calls from her board, her investors, 3 senators whose numbers were in her phone for reasons that had nothing to do with friendship, and a morning news program whose producer described the segment they wanted to do as inspiring. She declined the last one. She returned all the others in order of actual relevance and said the same careful, controlled things to each of them, which was what she was good at. She also received the file Priya had put together on Damien Cole. It was not a long file because Damien Cole was not a man who generated documentation. He had a business registration for Cole Automotive in Woodside, Queens, with a clean license and reasonable but unspectacular revenue. He had a rental agreement on a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner on a street where the buildings were close enough together that in summer the fire escapes practically touched. He had a daughter enrolled in the 3rd grade at a public school 4 blocks from the apartment. He had a truck with expired registration. She made a note to have someone not mention she'd noticed that, and a library card with 14 items currently checked out, most of them chapter books that Emma was probably working through. And then there was the other part of the file, 7 years in Naval Special Warfare, service record classified beyond what Priya could access through standard means. Two commendations that were listed but not described. Honorable discharge following a formal hardship separation request. That part was in the file, the reason behind it was not, but the timing put it 3 years ago, and 3 years ago was when Damian Cole had appeared in Woodside, Queens, and opened a mechanic shop and started taking Emma to the library, 14 books at a time. His wife's name had been Claire. She'd died of a long illness. Aurora did not dig further into that part. Some information you came to because it was offered, not because you went looking for it, and the distinction mattered to her more than she would have admitted. She closed the file and sat with it for a while. What bothered her was not that she'd been wrong about him. She'd been wrong about people before. She'd built an empire partly by learning faster than the next person when she was wrong and what to do about it. What bothered her was the specific nature of the mistake. She'd looked at him and seen poverty, and she'd processed poverty as absence, as the lack of things, the lack of capability, the lack of significance. And she'd done it in 3 seconds without a single additional piece of information. He had been sitting in a corner of a room she thought she understood, and he had understood it better than her from the first moment, and she hadn't been able to see it because she'd already decided what he was. She was 30 years old and had been called brilliant by people whose opinion she respected. She was finding, capable of a specific kind of blindness that brilliant people were sometimes especially prone to, the kind where the confidence that let you see quickly also let you stop looking too soon. She'd stopped looking at Damian Cole in 3 seconds. In the time it took her to do that, he'd probably already cataloged every exit. Her phone rang. It was Marcus Tate, checking in for the 3rd time that day. "I'm fine, Marcus." "I know you're fine. I'm calling because the AP ran a story this morning and Damian Cole is in it. They're calling him a hero." "He is a hero." A pause. "I spoke to a contact at the department. They're saying his background is significant." "I know." Another pause. "He turned down the interview requests. Both of them. And the network money." "I know that too. Most people don't do that. Most people aren't him." She stood up from her desk and walked to the window. 43rd floor, Midtown, the city spread out in every direction like an argument for something she'd never quite been able to put into words. "What are you actually calling to ask me, Marcus?" He was quiet for a moment. "I don't know yet," he said. "I think I'm just processing." "Join the club." She hung up and stood at the window, and the city did what it always did, which was continue being the city, indifferent and enormous and full of people she hadn't looked at carefully enough. She thought about a paper crown with plastic gemstones. She thought about a man who had walked into a room carrying nothing but his hands and his judgment and had been, by every measure that actually mattered, the most prepared person there. She thought about 3 seconds and what they cost and what it would take to stop letting herself spend them so carelessly. Outside, 30 blocks south and across the bridge, in a 2-bedroom apartment above a dry cleaner in Woodside, Queens, Damian Cole was at the kitchen table at 11:30 at night, filling out the police report paperwork that Ruiz had given him, a cold cup of coffee sitting at his elbow. The apartment quiet except for the sound of Emma breathing in the next room and the occasional groan of the building adjusting itself to the October cold. He wasn't thinking about the restaurant. He was thinking about whether Emma's school shoes were going to last another month, because he'd noticed the left one was starting to separate at the toe, and whether he could work a Saturday into the week to make up the hours he'd lose going to the precinct tomorrow, and whether the Nguyen family's minivan, which had been sitting in his 3rd bay for a week with a transmission problem that kept revealing new complications every time he thought he'd found the last one, was something he could finish by Friday, or whether he'd need to call them and have an uncomfortable conversation about timelines. He finished the paperwork. He put it in the envelope Ruiz had given him. He rinsed the coffee cup and turned off the kitchen light and checked the lock on the front door the way he always checked it. Handle down, deadbolt solid, the visual confirmation that was mostly habit, but was also, honestly, not entirely habit. He stood in the dark hallway outside Emma's room for a moment and listened to her breathe. Then he went to bed. He didn't sleep right away. He lay on his back in the dark and let his brain do what it needed to do. Run through the restaurant, run through the angles, run through the decisions. Not because he was second-guessing them, but because that was how it always worked afterward, the debrief that happened whether you wanted it to or not. Everything had moved the way it needed to move. The outcomes were as good as they were going to be. Emma was safe. He'd done what he needed to do and put it down. That was the whole thing. That was all of it. He turned on his side and closed his eyes. He thought briefly about the woman who'd gone to the floor when he'd told her to. The way she'd done it without hesitating after a split second of decision. The way she'd looked at him afterward, not with gratitude exactly, but with the particular intensity of someone recalibrating something they'd been certain of. He didn't know what to do with any of that. It wasn't his world. He let it go and went to sleep, and in the next room Emma dreamed whatever 8-year-olds dream, and the building settled around them, and the city kept being the city. The story broke on a Friday morning, and by Friday afternoon it had become the kind of story that feeds on itself. The AP piece ran first, a tight, factual account of the hostage situation at Aurelius, naming the 3 perpetrators, naming Kingsley Global as the apparent target, and describing the intervention of an unidentified patron in language that was careful enough to be accurate and vague enough to be irresistible. By noon, 2 television stations had picked it up. By 3 o'clock, someone had obtained grainy security footage from the restaurant's exterior cameras. Not the interior. The interior footage was part of an active investigation that showed the police arriving and, in the background, through the restaurant's tall front windows, the blurred and fragmentary shapes of what had already happened. It was enough. It was more than enough for the particular appetite of a Friday news cycle that needed something to hold on to over the weekend. By Saturday morning, Damian Cole's name was in print. He found out from his neighbor, Mrs. Petrakis, who knocked on his door at 7:45 with a plate of spanakopita and the information that she had seen his name on the television and wanted to make sure he was all right, and also that he ate something. She was 71 years old and had been bringing food to his door since Claire died, and he'd stopped trying to decline it approximately 2.5 years ago because it made her unhappy, and she was one of the better people he knew. He took the spanakopita and thanked her and closed the door and stood in his kitchen reading the news on his phone while Emma was still asleep. The coverage was not inaccurate exactly. It had the basic shape of what had happened: the armed men, the hostage situation, the intervention, the arrest. What it didn't have was texture, which meant the texture was being supplied by whoever was talking, and the people talking were other restaurant guests who had very specific experiences of the night and very limited vantage points on the parts that Damian had been involved in. The result was something that was true in its components and not quite right in its assembly, the way a photograph of a building tells you what the outside looks like, but nothing about whether the structure is sound. One guest described him as ex-military, obviously trained, completely fearless. Another said he'd taken out all 3 gunmen without anyone getting hurt, which was not accurate. One of the officers had a minor hand injury from the arrest of Webb near the entrance, and Caro had a broken arm, and Damian himself had a bruised rib from the initial table movement that he'd noticed around midnight when rolling over in bed had made him catch his breath. Nobody was writing about any of that because it was less clean than the version they were telling. He put the phone face down on the counter and made coffee. When Emma came out of her room at 8:15 in her pajamas with her hair flattened on one side from sleeping, she found him at the kitchen table with his coffee and the spanakopita and the look on his face that she associated with him, thinking hard about something he didn't want to talk about yet. "Is that from Mrs. Petrakis?" she asked, pointing at the plate. "Yeah. Can I have some?" "It's spinach." "I know what spanakopita is, Dad." He slid the plate toward her and she pulled out a piece and ate it standing up, which was something Claire used to do that he'd never pointed out to Emma because it wasn't relevant information, and also because some things you just kept. "There's stuff about you on the news," Emma said, matter-of-factly, around a bite. He looked up. "Where'd you see that?" "Marisol texted me." Marisol was Emma's best friend from school, age 8, and apparently had access to both a cell phone and national news coverage. "She said you're famous." "I'm not famous." "She said you're a hero." "I'm not that either." Emma considered him with the evaluating expression she'd inherited from someone. He'd never decided from whom. "You did the thing, though." "I did a thing. There's a difference." "What's the difference?" He thought about how to say it in a way that was true without being a lecture. "Heroes are people who do something they weren't ready for. I was ready. That's just training. That's different." She thought about this. "That seems like it still counts." "Eat your breakfast." "This is breakfast." "Emma." She took another piece of spanakopita and went to get a glass of juice and didn't bring it up again, which was one of the things about her that he was most grateful for. She knew when a conversation was done, and she respected it. She'd learned that from him, probably, which meant he'd done something right without meaning to. The phone call started at 9. The first was from a number he didn't recognize, which he let go to voicemail. The message was from a producer at a cable news network, friendly and professional, explaining that they were putting together a segment and would love to speak with him. He deleted it. The second call, 20 minutes later, was from a different network. Third was a print journalist from a national magazine. Fourth was a local television reporter who'd apparently gotten his number from someone at the precinct, which was something he intended to mention to Ruiz on Monday. He declined all of them, not by calling back, but by not calling back, which was a form of answer they eventually accepted. The fifth call, at 11:15, was from a number he also didn't recognize, but the voicemail was from a woman named Priya Nair, who identified herself as the executive assistant to Aurora Kingsley and said that Ms. Kingsley would very much like to speak with him at his convenience, and that she could be reached at the number provided, and that there was no pressure of any kind and no timeline attached to the request. He listened to that one twice. Then he set the phone down and went to the shop, because the Nguyen's minivan was still sitting in his third bay, and the transmission wasn't going to fix itself. And physical problems with defined solutions were, on days like this one, a significant comfort. The shop was 4 blocks from the apartment, a 3-bay garage on a side street that he'd taken over from a man named Sal Iacono, who'd run it for 30 years, and then decided at 68 that his back and the New York winters had reached an agreement that didn't include him continuing to crouch under vehicles. The signage still said Iacono's in faded letters above the main door, which Damien had always intended to change and never gotten around to. His name was on the business registration. That felt like enough. He worked for 3 hours on the transmission, which turned out to have one more complication he hadn't anticipated, which was about what he'd expected at this point. And he called Mrs. Nguyen at noon to explain that Friday was no longer realistic and offered her Saturday of the following week, and absorbed her disappointment with the patience of someone who understood that a family without a working minivan in Queens in October was genuinely inconvenient and that her frustration was appropriate. After he hung up, he sat on a rolling stool and ate a sandwich he'd brought from home and looked at the phone and thought about Aurora Kingsley. He'd looked her up after the restaurant, not because he was especially curious, but because he was the kind of person who gathered information about situations he'd been in, and Aurora Kingsley was a significant part of a situation he'd been in. Kingsley Global, founded 9 years ago from a small software licensing company that Aurora had purchased at 21, with money she'd made from an algorithm she'd written at 19, currently valued at somewhere north of $14 billion, depending on the quarter. 340 employees across 6 countries. Aurora herself on the covers of 4 major business publications in the last 2 years, in photographs that had the lit, controlled quality of images designed to say something specific about their subject. Capable, self-determined, not to be underestimated. He'd also seen the footage of her at a congressional hearing 2 years ago, where she'd sat for 4 hours in front of a committee that was examining data practices in the tech sector and had answered every question with a precision that was either perfectly calibrated transparency or the best performance of transparency he'd ever seen, and he still wasn't entirely sure which. She was, by every available measure, formidable. She was also the woman who had gone to the floor when he'd said drop, in the way that people go to the floor when they decide in real time that the person giving the instruction knows more than they do. That was not nothing. That kind of trust, extended in that kind of moment, was not nothing. He called the number at 1:15 in the afternoon. Priya answered on the second ring, which meant she'd been expecting him, which meant she was good at her job. Mr. Cole, thank you for calling back. Sure. Ms. Kingsley is available now if you have a moment. I'll put you through. There was a brief silence and then Aurora's voice, which was not quite what he'd expected, lower than it came across on the recorded materials he'd seen, with a slight roughness to it that suggested she'd been on calls most of the morning. Mr. Cole. Ms. Kingsley. I'll skip the part where I thank you because I don't think you're going to be comfortable with a long version of it, and I'm honestly not great at giving them. A brief pause. You handled what happened at that restaurant in a way that I've been thinking about for 2 days, and I don't entirely know what to do with it, so I thought I'd call. He leaned back on the stool. Okay. That's it? Just okay? I was waiting to find out what you actually wanted to say. She made a short sound that might have been a laugh. Fair. I want to meet with you, in person, not for a media thing, not for anything public. I've turned down all of those, and I assume you have too. Yeah. I'd like to have a conversation about what happened, but also about some things that came out of it that I think are worth discussing. Another pause, slightly longer this time. I recognize this is an unusual request. I recognize we don't know each other. And I recognize that you have no particular reason to be interested in anything I have to say. He thought about that for a moment. Where? A beat of surprise in her voice, quickly controlled. My office, Midtown. Whenever works for you. I can work around your schedule. Wednesday, he said. I close the shop at 6. Wednesday at 6:30 works. I'll have Priya send you the address. She paused again. Bring Emma if you want. We have a good break room. He wasn't sure what he'd expected her to say, but it wasn't that. She has school. Right, of course. Wednesday at 6:30 then. He hung up and sat with the phone in his hand for a moment, and then went back to the Nguyen's transmission, because he still had 2 hours of light left and a problem that, unlike most of the other things currently competing for his attention, he actually knew how to solve. The media attention did what media attention does. It peaked, and then began to ebb, the way water finds its own level. By Monday, the story had been absorbed into the general current of the news cycle, which needed new things to stay in motion and had found them. There were follow-up pieces, a few longer profiles attempted by reporters who couldn't get Damien to return calls and had to work around that absence, which produced articles that were largely about his absence, about the man who wouldn't be interviewed, which was somehow more interesting to certain readers than the man who would have been. He was described in these pieces as private, as modest, as stoic, as haunted, depending on which version of the story the writer wanted to tell. He wasn't any of those things particularly. He was a man who had a transmission to finish and a daughter to get to school in the mornings and a bruised rib that made sneezing actively unpleasant, and the story that was being told about him was happening in a different universe from the one he was living in. Detective Ruiz called on Monday to let him know that Caro and Webb had been formally charged and that the third man, the one whose elbow Damien had broken in the first seconds of the confrontation, whose name was Todd Seller, and who had a prior record that made his current situation significantly worse, had entered a cooperation agreement with the DA's office. The people who had hired Caro were, Ruiz said carefully, people whose names would become public in the course of the investigation, and Damien should be aware that as a key witness, he might be contacted again as proceedings developed. How long does that kind of thing usually take? Damien asked. Depends. Ruiz sounded like a man who had given this answer many times. Months, sometimes longer. Okay. You understand what cooperation agreement means in this context, right? Seller's going to give up his employers, the people who actually set this in motion. I understood. Just making sure. Some people hear cooperation agreement and think the guy walks. He won't walk. No, Ruiz agreed. He won't. A pause. How's the rib? Damien had not mentioned the rib in his statement. Fine. Right. Ruiz's voice had the dry quality of a man who is choosing not to pursue something. Take care of yourself, Mr. Cole. Emma's teacher, a woman named Ms. Okonkwo, who ran the third grade with a quiet authority that Damien genuinely respected, sent him an email on Tuesday saying that Emma had been completely normal at school, focused, engaged, a little quieter than usual, but not distressingly so, and that if he had any concerns about how Emma was processing recent events, the school had a counselor available. He wrote back thanking her because Ms. Okonkwo had gone out of her way, and that deserved acknowledgement. He thought about the counselor part and decided to watch Emma for another week before deciding anything. Emma, for her part, seemed to be doing what Emma generally did, which was absorb things, sit with them, and then produce some kind of question about them at an unexpected moment. On Tuesday evening, she came and sat at the kitchen table while he was going through invoices and said, without preamble, "Did you know you were going to be able to do it? At the restaurant?" He put the invoices down. Do what? Stop those guys. He considered the question seriously because she'd asked it seriously. I thought I could. I didn't know. Is that scary? Not knowing? A little. But you did it anyway. Yeah. She pulled a piece of paper toward her from the stack he'd moved aside and started folding it, the way she always did when she was working something out. Is that what brave is? Doing it when you don't know? That's part of it. What's the other part? Knowing what's worth doing it for. She considered this, folding and refolding. The paper became something that might have been a boat, or might have been an attempt at a bird that hadn't quite resolved. Because of me, she said. Not a question. Yeah, he said. Because of you. She nodded, like this was information she'd suspected and was now confirmed. Okay, she said, and picked up the paper boat bird and took it back to her room. And that was the end of the conversation. He sat at the kitchen table for a while after she left and looked at the invoices without seeing them. The Kingsley Global Building was in Midtown, a glass and steel tower that managed to look both expensive and deliberately understated. The architecture of a company that wanted you to know it could afford more flash than this and had chosen not to bother, which was its own kind of statement. Damien arrived at 6:20 on Wednesday in his truck, which he parked in a garage 2 blocks away because the building's street frontage had no parking and he wasn't going to leave it in a loading zone, and he wore the same plaid shirt because it was his best one, and also because he was not going to perform a version of himself for a meeting he hadn't fully decided was a good idea. The lobby security guard asked for ID and made a call and then directed him to the 43rd floor, which was the executive level, which he could have guessed. Priya met him at the elevator. She was small, efficient-looking, with the kind of organized energy that radiated from people who had made a discipline out of anticipating what other people needed. She shook his hand and walked him down a corridor with the unhurried pace of someone who knew the building well enough to not think about it, pointing out nothing because there was nothing that required pointing out. Aurora was in her office, standing at the window when he came in. The same view he'd read about in a profile piece. The city at night from the 43rd floor, which looked the way you'd expect it to look from 43 floors up, which was large and indifferent and genuinely impressive despite that. She turned when he came in, and there was a brief moment where they both registered each other without the emergency context that had surrounded every previous second of their acquaintance. She looked, in person and not in crisis, like someone who had been tired for a long time and had gotten so good at functioning in that state that the tiredness had become structural, part of how she stood, part of how her eyes held things. She'd changed since the restaurant. The gown was gone, replaced by the kind of clothes that read as casual without being casual, dark trousers and a simple top that probably cost more than his monthly rent. And she'd pulled her hair back in a way that suggested she'd done it herself at some point in the afternoon and hadn't thought about it since. Mr. Cole, she said, Damien's fine. Aurora. She gestured toward a seating area near the window. A low table, 2 chairs, a couch. The casual geography of an office set up for real conversations rather than presentations. Thank you for coming. You said you'd skip the gratitude part. That was just politeness, not gratitude. She sat down across from him. There's a difference. He sat. Up close, the cut above her eyebrow had healed to a thin, faint line. She'd apparently declined the stitches, which left a small mark that would probably stay for a while. He noticed her notice him noticing it. Small souvenir, she said, touching it briefly with 2 fingers. Fades eventually. You speak from experience. Some. Priya appeared at the door with 2 coffees and set them on the table and disappeared without being asked to do either thing. Aurora wrapped both hands around her cup. I want to talk about what happened at the restaurant, she said, but I also want to say something first, about before it happened. He waited. When you came in that night, I saw you. I clocked you in about 3 seconds, and I made a decision about what you were and what you weren't, and I moved on. She said it flatly, like she was reading a finding in a report about someone she didn't like very much. I do that. I'm fast at reading rooms, and I'm usually right enough that I've stopped questioning the speed. I was wrong about you in a way I haven't been wrong about someone in a long time, and I've been thinking about what that says about how I actually make decisions versus how I think I make them. He looked at her. What do you think it says? That I see poverty and I subtract. She said it the same flat way. Not performing shame, not performing confession, just stating a finding. I look at a man in a worn shirt with grease on his hands and I subtract things from the column of what he might be capable of. I've been doing that my whole life, and mostly it doesn't matter because the subtraction doesn't affect anyone. With you, it mattered. You were the most capable person in that room, and I'd written you out of the picture before you'd sat down. Damien was quiet for a moment. He turned the coffee cup in his hands. You went to the floor, he said. Excuse me? When I told you to drop, you did it. That fast. He looked up at her. You made a decision in about half a second that I was someone worth listening to, in the middle of a hostage situation, when you had every reason to not trust anything you couldn't verify. That's not nothing. She looked at him for a moment with something that was hard to name. You're being generous. I'm being accurate. Generous would be pretending you didn't do the other part too. He set the cup down. Both things happened. You saw me as nothing, and then you made a correct call under pressure. People aren't one thing. No, she said slowly. They're not. She looked at him in the way she'd looked at him from across the restaurant floor. That recalibrating quality. The measurement being run again. You're harder to talk to than I expected. Because I'm not agreeing with your self-assessment? Because you're being fair when I'm trying to hold myself accountable, and those are different things. And somehow you're making accountability feel less uncomfortable by insisting on the fair part. He looked at her. Is that a complaint? I'm not sure yet. There was a pause that wasn't uncomfortable so much as careful. Two people at the beginning of a conversation feeling out its actual shape, which was different from the shape either of them had planned. She picked up her coffee. I want to talk to you about something specific, she said, and I need you to hear it as an actual proposal, not as a pity gesture. Because if you hear it as pity, you're going to say no before you've thought about it, and I think you should think about it. Go ahead. She looked at her cup for a moment, then back at him. Kingsley Global has a corporate security division, 12 people, good contractors, solid systems. It's run by Marcus Tate, who is competent in ways that Thursday night partially disproved. She said this without savagery. It was simply another finding. I've been looking at how we're structured. We have good people doing defensive work. Nobody doing strategic threat assessment. Nobody looking at how we identify and prevent the kind of thing that happened before it reaches the level where someone needs to be physically removed from a restaurant by a mechanic from Queens. He looked at her. You're offering me a job. I'm describing a position that doesn't technically exist yet that I want to create, and then saying you're the person I want to fill it, which is, yes, an offer. She set her cup down. Before you answer, hear the structure. I'm not asking you to stop being a mechanic. I'm not asking you to wear a different kind of shirt. I'm asking you to come in 3 days a week, assess our security posture, work with Marcus on threat identification, and tell me where we're blind. Because we're clearly blind in some places. And I'd rather know where those places are before the next time someone walks through my front door with a plan. He was quiet for a longer moment. The city was doing its thing beyond the window. Lights, movement, the permanent restless activity of 8 million people going about the business of their lives. Why me? He said. It wasn't quite a question. Because I watched you read that room in real time from a corner table, she said. You knew before the rest of us what was happening and what was going to happen and what the options were. That's not something I can hire through a standard process. And because she stopped, and for the first time since he'd come in, she looked slightly less certain of her words. Because you're the kind of person who does what's right without needing to be recognized for it. And I've been in rooms with a lot of people who claim to be that, and almost none of them actually are. And I think what I'm building here needs more of it. He thought about the shop. He thought about the Nguyen's minivan and the invoices on his kitchen table and the bruised rib and the school shoes with the separating toe. He thought about Emma's paper boat bird and what it meant to her that he'd been there that night, that he'd been the thing standing between her and what could have happened. He thought about 3 days a week. I'd need to keep the shop, he said. I said as much. And my hours are my hours. I have a daughter with a school schedule and she comes first. That's not an issue. And I'm not doing media. No interviews, no profiles, no standing next to you at press events. Something moved in her face. Respect, possibly, or the recognition of someone who knew what they needed and said it plainly. None of that was part of what I described. He nodded slowly. He looked out the window at the city and then back at her. I want to think about it, he said. That's the right answer, she said. People who say yes to things this fast are either desperate or not listening. You're neither. She picked up her coffee again. There's no timeline. Think about it. Ask me questions if you have them. She paused. Can I ask you one? Go ahead. Emma. She said the name carefully, like she was handling something she respected the weight of. Is she actually okay? After Thursday? He looked at her for a moment. She asked me if it was scary to do something when you didn't know if you could. What did you tell her? The truth. Which was? That it was a little. and that you do it anyway when you know what's worth doing it for. Aurora looked at him for a long moment. The city went on behind her, 43 floors of it, all that light and noise and motion and money, all that accumulated ambition stacked up against the sky. She sounds like an extraordinary kid, she said. She's 8, he said. She's just figuring out what kind of person she is. Same as everyone. He stood, which was also an answer of a kind. He was done for tonight. He had his information. He would take it home and sit with it. She got a lot of it from her mother. He said it simply, not as an appeal for sympathy, and not as a door he was opening. He said it as a fact he was stating because it was true, and because he'd decided at some point in the years since Claire died that refusing to say her name in ordinary conversation was a form of erasure he didn't want to practice. Aurora didn't say she was sorry. She didn't fill the space with something that would have required him to manage her feelings about it. She just nodded, and something in the quality of her silence suggested she understood why he'd said it the way he had. "I'll walk you to the elevator," she said. They walked down the corridor and she pressed the button, and they stood for a moment in the brief suspended time of waiting for an elevator, which is its own particular social situation, requiring some words or no words, and the choice between them is always revealing. "The food was good," he said. "At the restaurant, before everything." She blinked. "I didn't actually get to eat." "The risotto was good. I had maybe 4 bites of it." He considered. "The bread was really good." She looked at him with an expression that had something unwilling in it, unwilling to be amused, already there. "The bread," she said. "It was very good bread." The elevator opened. He stepped in and she put her hand briefly on the door to hold it, and she looked at him one more time with that recalibrating expression. "Think about it, Damien," she said. "I will," he said, and meant it. The doors closed, and he rode down 43 floors in the quiet, and at the bottom he walked out through the lobby and into the cold October night, and the city was the city, and he put his hands in his pockets and walked the 2 blocks to where he'd parked his truck and drove home. He got back at 7:50. Emma was at the kitchen table with her homework, and Mrs. Petrakis was sitting across from her, apparently supervising, with a small plate of cookies between them that Emma was working through with the focused efficiency of someone who understood the strategic value of finishing homework adjacent to a food source. "Dad?" Emma said, without looking up. "How'd it go?" "Fine." "Did she offer you a job?" He stopped. "Why would you think that?" Marisol's mom said billionaires always try to hire the people who save their lives in movies. Emma looked up. "Is it like the movies?" "It's not like the movies." "But she offered you a job." He hung his jacket on the hook by the door. "Go back to your homework." "I'll take that as a yes," Emma said, and went back to her homework, and Mrs. Petrakis looked at Damien over Emma's head with the expression of someone who had been enjoying this exchange considerably and was not going to pretend otherwise. He sat down at the table and took a cookie, which was better than the cookies had any right to be, and he looked at his daughter doing her math with a pencil she kept forgetting to sharpen, and thought about 3 days a week and what it would mean and what it wouldn't, and whether the thing he'd spent 3 years building in Queens, the small, honest, manageable life that was mostly enough, could hold something new in it without losing its shape. He didn't have an answer yet, but he thought about Emma's question from the other night, the one about bravery, and what he'd said about knowing what was worth doing it for, and he thought that the answer to this particular question was somewhere in there too, if he was willing to look for it. He took another cookie and did not say this out loud, because some thoughts worked better in the quiet, and because Mrs. Petrakis would eventually go home, and because Emma still had 2 pages of math left, and the night was doing what nights do, moving forward, carrying everything in it along, indifferent to whether you were ready or not. He said yes on a Saturday. Not in person, not in a meeting. He called Priya's number at 10 in the morning while Emma was at her friend Marisol's apartment 2 floors up, and when Priya put him through to Aurora, he said it the same way he said most things, which was directly and without decoration. "I'll take the position, 3 days a week, my hours, no media. Same conditions as I said Wednesday." "Same conditions," Aurora confirmed. A brief pause. "I'm glad." "Don't make it a thing." "I wasn't going to." "Your voice was going to." Another pause, and this time there was something in it that might have been her deciding not to argue the point. "Monday works." He hung up and stood in his kitchen for a minute, looking at nothing in particular. Then he went to the shop because he had 3 vehicles queued for the week, and starting Monday, his available days were going to shift, which meant the math of the week needed to be reorganized, and reorganizing the math of the week was the kind of concrete problem that always helped him think. He told Mrs. Petrakis that evening when she stopped by with a container of lentil soup. She listened to the outline of it with the patient attention she gave to everything. She was a woman who had raised 4 children largely by herself after her husband's death, had worked as a seamstress for 30 years, and had developed as a result the quality of someone who understood that life changes shape on you whether you plan it or not, and that the useful question is never whether the change happened, but what you do next. "Good," she said when he'd finished explaining. "That's it? Just good? What do you want me to say? You're doing something useful, you're providing for Emma, you're using what you know." She picked up her soup container. "Good covers it." He looked at her for a moment. "She's not a bad person," he said. "Aurora. She's got her own things to work through, but she's not a bad person." Mrs. Petrakis gave him the look she reserved for statements that she found obvious. "People in positions don't usually get there by being bad," she said. "They get there by being driven in a direction, and sometimes the direction is narrow. That's different from bad." She moved toward the door. "The soup needs 20 minutes on low. Don't let Emma eat all the bread before dinner." He nodded, and she left, and he stood in the kitchen with the soup on the stove and thought about what she'd said, and thought it was more or less right, and thought that he probably should have asked Mrs. Petrakis' opinion earlier and saved himself several days of internal back and forth. Monday arrived the way Mondays do, with no particular ceremony. He dropped Emma at school at 8, was at the shop by 8:15 to leave notes for Danny, his part-time mechanic, 19 years old, currently in his first year of a vocational certification program, and good with his hands in a way that would eventually outpace his tendency to underestimate his own work, and was in the Kingsley Global lobby by 9:45, having spent 12 minutes finding parking in Midtown that didn't require a second mortgage. Priya had a badge waiting for him at the security desk. It was a standard access badge with his photo, which had been taken from his driver's license without his being consulted, and it made him look like a man who had just been informed of unexpected and inconvenient news. He clipped it to his jacket and didn't comment. Marcus Tate was waiting by the elevator bank. Damien had looked Marcus up the same way he'd looked up Aurora. Former Secret Service, 12 years, 2 presidential protection details before he'd gone private. His record was solid in the way that government protective service records are solid. Lots of preventions, almost no incidents, which is the whole point. He was 44, broad-shouldered, with the compact watchfulness of someone who had spent a long time in rooms full of important people while being neither visible nor invisible, just present, just ready. He looked at Damien the way Damien looked at most things, assessing, neutral, withholding judgment until there was more information. "Mr. Cole." He extended his hand. "Damien." "Marcus." His handshake was firm without being a performance. "I'd like to show you how we're currently set up before you draw any conclusions." "That's reasonable." "I also want to say something directly, because I think it's better said than not." Marcus held the elevator. "Thursday night was a failure. Not yours, mine. I should have had coverage on her, and I didn't, because we've been operating on the assumption that the highest risk scenarios for Kingsley Global were digital, not physical. That assumption was wrong." He said it without self-pity and without the kind of excessive self-flagellation that becomes its own indulgence. Just the statement, cleanly delivered. "Aurora told me she's bringing you in to help address that gap. I'm not going to make that harder than it needs to be." Damien looked at him for a moment. "Okay," he said. "Okay? You said what you needed to say. I'm not going to perform being impressed by it." He stepped into the elevator. "Show me the setup." Marcus's expression shifted, not warmly, exactly, but in the way of a man who'd just gotten information that was useful. He stepped in beside him, and the doors closed. What followed was 4 hours that Damien would later describe to Emma, in the abbreviated form appropriate for an 8-year-old, as looking at how a building works. What it actually was, a systematic walkthrough of Kingsley Global's physical and procedural security infrastructure, was informative in the way that looking at a good foundation with a new crack is informative. The foundation was real. The crack was real. The question was whether anyone had been looking at the crack long enough to understand how deep it went. The physical setup was solid. Marcus's team ran tight access control, had clear protocols for visitor management, and had invested in camera systems that covered the building's primary entry and exit points with no meaningful gaps. The lobby was well managed, the elevator access was card-controlled above the third floor, and the executive level had a secondary authentication requirement that was recent. Marcus had added it 2 weeks before the restaurant, which was both good instinct and 3 days too late to matter. The gap, as Damien saw it within the first 2 hours, was not in the building. It was in everything outside the building. "Your threat modeling is inside out," Damien said, at the end of a review session in Marcus's office. A spare, orderly room that smelled of coffee and had one framed photograph on the wall, a landscape somewhere in the Pacific Northwest, which was the only personal item in the space. "You're very good at protecting a fixed location. You're not thinking about the space between locations." Marcus crossed his arms, not defensively, just listening with his whole body, the way people do when they're taking something seriously. "Explain." "Aurora moves. She's in this building. She's at events. She's at restaurants, apparently. She's in cars between all of those things. Your coverage in transit is thinner than your coverage here. The restaurant incident wasn't a failure of your building security. It was a failure to account for what happens when she's outside your perimeter." He paused. "Who selected Aurelius for that dinner?" "Her assistant made the reservation." "How far in advance?" Marcus was quiet for a moment. 3 weeks. So anyone monitoring her calendar or her assistant's communications had 3 weeks to plan around a known location and time. He let that sit. "The reservation was made through the restaurant's standard booking system?" "Yes." "Which is accessible to anyone with the right tools and the right target." He looked at Marcus. "You see what I'm saying?" "We were the vulnerability," Marcus said. "Not a question. Our own scheduling practices. Not just scheduling, communication patterns, public appearances, the predictability of how she moves through the world." Damien leaned back in his chair. "She's a public figure. That creates a specific kind of exposure that's different from what you'd manage for a corporate facility. You can't make her invisible. You can make her less predictable." Marcus uncrossed his arms. He picked up a pen and turned it in his fingers in a way that suggested he was thinking in a direction he hadn't been thinking before. "That's a significant operational change." "Yeah." "Aurora's not going to love all of it." "Probably not." Damien looked at the landscape photograph on the wall. He'd been wondering about it for 2 hours, and he decided to let himself wonder a little longer and not ask. "She'll understand the reasoning. Whether she likes it and whether she understands it are different questions." "You've known her for a week." "I've known her for 1 meeting and a phone call, but she's the kind of person who accepts correct information even when it's uncomfortable. That came through pretty clearly at the restaurant." Marcus looked at him. "She followed your instructions." "She followed correct instructions. The fact that they were mine was secondary." Marcus was quiet for a moment. Then he made a note on his pad, the first actual note he'd made in 4 hours, which told Damien that everything before this had been going into a part of his brain that stored things without writing them down. "I want to propose something," Marcus said. "Formal threat assessment. Everything from her public calendar management to vehicle routing to communication protocols. Written, comprehensive, starting from scratch. I've got 2 people on my team who are good at this kind of work. I'd want to run it with you." "That's the job," Damien said. I know, I just want to be clear that I mean it as a joint thing, not you reviewing what we produce, you in the room when we produce it." Damien nodded. "That works." They went to lunch at a diner 2 blocks from the building, the kind of place with laminate menus and coffee that was not good, but was hot and served in a heavy ceramic mug that felt honest in your hand. They talked about threat assessment methodology for 40 minutes, and then Marcus asked, without particular segue, how long Damien had been out of the Navy, and Damien told him, and Marcus told him he'd done 8 years in the Army before the Secret Service, and they sat with that shared information for a moment the way veterans sometimes do, not bonding over it exactly, but acknowledging it the way you acknowledge any significant common experience, which is without needing to describe what it felt like. "Different world," Marcus said. "Yeah." "You miss it?" Damien considered this seriously, because Marcus had asked it seriously and deserved a real answer. "Sometimes I miss having a clear objective," he said. "Everything has a clear objective when you're in it. You know what success looks like. Outside," he moved his hand slightly, Outside success is harder to define. Is the shop success? The shop is what I needed it to be for a few years. Emma needed stable. I needed simple. It worked. He drank his coffee. This might be what comes next. I don't know yet. Fair answer, Marcus said. They went back to this building and worked for another 2 hours, and by the time Damien left at 4:30 to get Emma from after-school care, he had a clearer picture of the problem and the beginning of an idea about how to address it, and Marcus Tate had the look of a man who had been braced for something he didn't want and found instead something he could work with. The first 3 weeks had the texture of adjustment. He was in the building Monday, Wednesday, and Friday. He kept the shop running Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday, with Danny picking up more hours and doing it well enough that Damien had the slightly uncomfortable realization that the business was not as dependent on his daily presence as he'd been treating it. He mentioned this to Danny, who said, with the directness of a 19-year-old who doesn't yet know he's supposed to soften things, "Yeah, you kind of hover, Mr. Cole. The cars don't actually need you to watch them." He told this to Emma, who found it genuinely funny. At Kingsley Global, he worked with Marcus and 2 members of his team, a woman named Sasha who had come up through corporate intelligence and had a mind for pattern recognition that Damien found immediately useful, and a man named Brendan who was younger, less experienced, but asked better questions than people twice his age, which in Damien's experience was the more important quality. Together, the 4 of them spent 2 weeks producing a threat assessment document that Marcus described to Aurora as the most uncomfortable thing I've read in my professional career, which was high praise from someone in his line of work. Aurora read it in one sitting. She called Damien at 7:30 the following morning, which was a Tuesday, not one of his Kingsley days, and he was under the Nguyen's minivan, which he had finally gotten back, and which had developed a new and creative problem that he was choosing to interpret as the universe's sense of humor. He answered anyway, because it was Aurora's number, and the document was important. "I have questions," she said. "Good morning." "Good morning, I have questions." He rolled out from under the van on his creeper board and sat up. "Go ahead." Page 14, the section on calendar management. You're recommending a 48-hour gap between public calendar confirmation and actual movement, which means I can't confirm appearances until 2 days out. Do you understand what that does to my scheduling? Yes. And you still recommend it? The 3-week visible booking window is what got us to Aurelius. The gap is not convenient, it's necessary. Silence on her end. Working through something, silence, not objecting silence. He'd started to be able to tell the difference. "What about the communication protocols?" she said. Page 19, you're recommending end-to-end encryption for all assistant scheduling communications, including vendor contacts. Any system that includes your schedule needs to be secure. Priya's been using the same systems for 6 years. Priya's systems were designed for efficiency. We need them designed for both. He looked at the underside of the Nguyen's minivan, which continued to be a problem. You can have efficient and secure. It's more work to set up and less work once it's running. Another pause. Page 23. The vehicle routing. You want randomized routing for any movement within a 12-block radius of this building. Predictable patterns are exploitable. A randomized routing protocol costs nothing except a brief daily planning step. Damien. Her voice had the slight edge it got when she was pushing back on something she was also half accepting. This is a significant operational disruption. I know. You're not going to soften any of it. No. Why not? Because you didn't hire me to soften things. You hired me because you have a gap in your security posture and you know it, and filling that gap is going to require changing how you operate. If you want someone to design a system that causes minimal disruption, Marcus can do that, but it'll be less secure. A longer pause. The shop was quiet around him, just the ambient sounds of the street outside and the tick of the engine above him cooling down. "All right," she said, "walk me through implementation." They talked for 40 minutes. She asked good questions, specific, practical, aimed at understanding rather than at finding reasons to object. And he answered them the same way, and by the end of it, most of the recommendations were moving toward a yes, with 2 under discussion and 1 she was going to need more time on. "The vehicle routing one," she said, near the end. "I want to revisit it. It's the most important one." "I understand that. I just need to think about the operational impact more carefully." A pause. "I'll have Priya put time on the calendar. You and me and Marcus this week. Thursday works. Thursday. She was quiet for a second. Can I ask you something? Go ahead. How are you doing with all of this? The adjustment, the new schedule. He considered the question. It was asked in the way she asked things when she was genuinely curious, direct, without social padding, but not without care. He'd noticed that about her. She didn't warm up to questions. She just asked them. It's fine, he said. It's a different kind of work. I don't hate it. Rousing endorsement. I'm still figuring out if I'm good at the parts that aren't field assessment, the office parts. You're better at them than you think. Marcus said something to that effect. He hadn't expected that. Marcus said that. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, that you ask the right questions and don't talk when you don't have anything to say, and that in his experience, that combination is rarer than it should be. A slight pause. He also said you eat lunch like someone who was trained to eat fast and hasn't fully let go of it. He's not wrong about that. Emma doing okay with the new schedule? She's fine. She's got Mrs. Petrakis, and Marisol's mother helps with pickup on the days I'm running late. He brushed some grit off his palm. She asked when she was going to get to see the building. I meant it when I said she was welcome. Bring her on a Friday. We can do the building tour. Priya will take her to the break room. I'll try not to be in a meeting. Try? I'm in a lot of meetings. I'll let her know it's tentative, he said, which was as close to a yes as he had for that particular item right now, and she accepted it as such. He hung up and rolled back under the Nguyen's van and spent another 40 minutes locating what turned out to be the actual source of the problem, which had been hiding behind the thing he'd thought was the source of the problem for 3 weeks. And when he found it, he felt the specific satisfaction of a solved puzzle that physical work produces in a way that almost nothing else does. Clean, definite, done. The wider world was also, in its messier way, working through its own version of resolution. The DA's office announced formal charges against the 3 men from the restaurant in early November. Sellers' cooperation agreement had, as Ruiz had indicated, produced names. 2 executives from a private equity firm that had lost a significant lawsuit against Kingsley Global 18 months prior and had apparently decided that the legitimate legal process had failed them and that other methods were worth attempting. These men were arrested on a Tuesday morning with the kind of quiet efficiency that law enforcement brings to the arrest of people who have lawyers on retainer and no instinct to run, and their names were in the financial press by afternoon. Aurora's statement on the matter was 6 sentences prepared with legal counsel and said what it needed to say without saying anything it didn't need to. She handled the media that day with the same composure she handled most things, present, controlled, giving nothing extra. Damien read about it on his phone during his lunch break and thought about the particular ugliness of people who had enough and decided someone else's having was an offense against them. And then he put the phone away and finished his sandwich and went back to work. The connection between Damien's role in the restaurant incident and his new position at Kingsley Global became public knowledge in the 3rd week of November, when a business reporter at a financial publication put together enough threads to run a piece titled "The Mechanic Who Moved into the C-Suite," which was inaccurate in several meaningful ways, but contained the core facts correctly enough that it couldn't be objected to on grounds of accuracy. The piece ran on a Wednesday. By Thursday, 3 more publications had cited it. By Friday, Damien had declined 4 more interview requests, which was starting to feel like a hobby. Aurora called on Friday evening. He was making dinner, pasta, because it was fast and Emma would eat it without negotiation, which was the dual criterion he applied to Friday night meals. "Have you seen the piece?" she said. "Yeah." "You're handling the requests?" "By not handling them." "Good." A pause. "I want to tell you something. The board had questions this week about the hire, about the optics of it. A hire that came directly out of a public incident, how it looks, whether it reads as reactive rather than strategic." He stirred the pasta. "What did you tell them?" "I told them it was both, and that those weren't mutually exclusive, and that I'd been reactive in the specific sense that I'd identified a real gap in response to a real event, which is what reactive decision-making is supposed to produce, and that the strategy going forward was sound." A brief pause. "I also told them that the individual I'd hired had been in that restaurant protecting his 8-year-old daughter's birthday dinner and had neutralized 3 armed men in under 4 minutes, and that if they had a criticism of that decision, they should say it out loud so I could hear it. He didn't say anything for a moment. How'd that land? It landed, she said. There was a pause on the line that was comfortable in the way that pauses between people who have said the things they needed to say can be. Aurora, he said. Yeah. The board call sounds like it was hard. It was fine. It wasn't fine. You just described defending a decision that was right to people who should have trusted you to make it, and you did it alone. He moved the pasta off the heat. That's not fine. That's just something you're used to. Silence on her end. Not the processing kind, a different kind. The kind that meant something had landed that she hadn't been expecting. You're doing it again, she said finally. Doing what? Making accountability feel less comfortable by being fair about it. You said that last time. It's still true. Her voice had shifted slightly, less composed, in a way that felt more like her actual voice and less like the professional register she lived in most of the time. I'm going to say something and you're allowed to disagree. Go ahead. I think you might be one of the better people I've met in a long time, and I spend a significant amount of time around people who are supposed to be impressive. He looked at the pasta cooling on the stove. He didn't respond right away, not because he didn't know what to say, but because he wanted to say the right thing and not the easy thing, which was a distinction he'd always thought was worth the extra second. I think you're figuring something out, he said finally, about what you want the company to be, what you want to be. And I think that process is going to make you someone pretty different from who you were 3 months ago, and I think that's worth more than impressive. Quiet on the line. I'll see you Monday, he said. Monday, she said. Tell Emma Friday is locked in if she wants the building tour. She's going to want the building tour. Good. And he could hear in her voice, just at the edge of it, something that was new, something lighter than the register she usually carried, something that hadn't been there in that first meeting in the restaurant when he'd watched her process what had just happened to her. Good night, Damien. Night. He set the phone on the counter and called Emma for dinner, and she came in still wearing the soccer shin guards she'd had on since after school, because she always forgot to take them off, which was something he kept meaning to say something about, and never quite got to. Pasta, she said. Pasta. What kind of sauce? The red kind. Is there meat in it? There's meat in it. She climbed into her chair and pulled the bowl toward her and ate with the focused enthusiasm of someone who'd spent the afternoon kicking a ball against the building's courtyard wall, which he knew because Mrs. Petrakis had reported this to him with a mixture of admiration and concern for the wall. Dad? Emma said, halfway through the bowl. Yeah. Aurora said I can come see the building Friday. He looked up. When did she say that? She texted me. He put his fork down. She has your number? Priya asked for it, for scheduling. Emma looked at him in the way she looked at him when she thought he was being slow about something obvious. She said the break room has a really good snack situation. He looked at his daughter, shin guards still on, pasta sauce on her chin, completely unconcerned by any of the ways the last month had rearranged the geography of their lives. 8 years old and already better than him at letting things become new without grieving what they'd been. Yeah, he said. Friday. Emma nodded and went back to her pasta, and he picked up his fork again, and outside the apartment the neighborhood did its thing. Voices somewhere on the street, a car with music going past, the specific acoustic texture of a Queen's evening in late November. And the kitchen was warm and the food was hot, and Damien Cole sat across from his daughter and let himself carefully and without fanfare consider the possibility that what came next might be all right. Not perfect, not without cost or difficulty or the particular loneliness that didn't fully leave no matter how many good things arrived to share the space with it. Not without the weight of everything that had brought him to this kitchen, in this apartment, above this dry cleaner on this street, in this city that was too large and too cold and in its way, exactly where he was supposed to be. But all right, maybe more than that. He ate his pasta and didn't say any of this out loud, and the evening moved forward the way evenings do, one ordinary moment at a time. Emma wore her good dress to the building tour, not the white one with yellow flowers. That one had been dry cleaned and hung back in her closet with the particular reverence she'd started giving it after the restaurant, like it had been somewhere important and deserved to be treated accordingly. She wore the blue one instead, the one with the small buttons down the front that she could do herself now, which had been a point of significant pride for approximately 3 months. She also wore the shin guards until they were in the elevator of their building, at which point Damien looked at her and she looked at him and she went back inside and took them off without being asked. She was 9 years old in 6 days. He'd been thinking about that. The birthday, the year that had passed, the distance between one October and the next. A year ago, he'd been on a 3-week waiting list for a corner table in a restaurant he couldn't afford, trying to give his daughter one evening that was bigger than their usual life. 12 months later, he was driving to Midtown on a Friday with a building badge in his jacket pocket and a daughter in a blue dress asking him detailed questions about how tall the Kingsley Global Tower was in feet and also in meters, because they were doing metrics in school and she wanted to practice. 43 floors, he said. That's not meters. I don't know the meters. You should know the meters, Dad. It's good to know both. I'll look it up. I already looked it up, she said, and told him the number, which he immediately forgot. And she said the number again when they were standing outside the building looking up at it, and he nodded and forgot it again. And she gave him the expression that meant she had accepted that some things about him were permanent. Priya met them in the lobby with the particular warmth of someone who had been briefed on Emma and had taken it seriously. She crouched to Emma's eye level, which was something adults often skipped, and said, "I've been hearing about you. I heard you counted 4 chandeliers." Emma considered whether this information being known was good or bad. "There were 4, she confirmed, at the other restaurant. There are 2 in our lobby," Priya said, "in case you were counting." Emma counted them. She reported the number as 2. Priya said that was correct. They established between themselves, in approximately 40 seconds, a working relationship that Damien recognized as the kind of thing Emma did. She assessed adults the way he assessed rooms, quickly and on her own terms. And once she'd decided someone was worth trusting, she trusted them fully and without qualification. The tour took 90 minutes. Priya walked them through the building in a way that was genuinely informative rather than performed. She knew the place the way people know places they love, with the casual depth of someone who had been everywhere in it and remembered all of it. She showed Emma the engineering floor where the servers lived in their temperature-controlled rows and explained what they did in terms that were accurate without being condescending. She showed her the design studio on 16 where a woman named Kai was working on something at a screen that looked like geometry and color in conversation, and Kai turned around and let Emma look and answered the question about what it was. A user interface for a medical scheduling application, which sounds boring, but it's actually about how people feel when they're scared and need information fast, in a way that Emma thought about for the rest of the tour. She showed her the break room last, which had, as advertised, a genuinely impressive snack situation. "Take whatever you want," Priya said. Emma looked at Damien. He nodded. She selected a granola bar and a small bag of pretzels with the deliberateness of someone making decisions that mattered, and then changed the granola bar for a different flavor after brief reflection. "Good choice," Priya said. "I almost got the other one," Emma said. "I know, it's a harder call than it looks." They were in the break room when Aurora appeared in the doorway, which she'd apparently timed without making it look timed. She was in the building. The tour was near the end. She came by, which was a casual thing, and not a formal thing, which was the right read of what it needed to be. She looked at Emma with the directness she brought to most things, which was only slightly modified for the fact that she was looking at a 9-year-old in a blue dress eating pretzels. "You must be Emma." Emma looked at her with equivalent directness. "You're Aurora." "I am." "You're taller than I thought." Aurora looked briefly at Damien, who offered nothing. "Is that good or bad?" she asked Emma. "Neutral," Emma said. "I just thought you'd be shorter from the pictures." "Pictures make people look shorter?" "Sometimes." Emma held out the pretzels because she was, beneath the assessment, a generous person who offered food to people. "Do you want some?" Aurora took 2 pretzels. She leaned against the doorframe and ate them, which was not the posture of a CEO in her own building being formally introduced to an employee's child. It was just a person eating pretzels. "Your dad says you're good at math," Aurora said. "He says that because I'm better at it than him." "That's not a high bar?" "It's a reasonable bar," Emma said, with the fairness of a judge. "He's not bad. He's just not practicing." "Adults don't practice enough," Aurora agreed. That's what Ms. Okonkwo says. Ms. Okonkwo is right. Damien stood to the side and watched his daughter talk to one of the most powerful people in the city, like they were two people who had simply found themselves in the same room with pretzels, which was, he decided, exactly what they were, and the fact that it was as easy as it was told him something about both of them that he would spend a while thinking about later. They left at 4:30. Emma was quiet in the elevator down, not in a troubled way, but in the way she got when she was processing, which he recognized as the working through it silence that always preceded a question or a conclusion. In the lobby, she said, "She's different than I thought." "Different how?" Emma considered. "I thought she'd be more performative, like when adults are around kids and they do the voice. She didn't do the voice. She doesn't do the voice with adults either." Emma nodded, satisfied with this as a consistency. "She's a little lonely," she said. He looked at her. "Why do you say that?" "I don't know. She just is." Emma shrugged with the simplicity of someone stating something observable. "It's okay. She's getting less." He didn't ask how she knew that. He'd learned over 9 years that some things Emma knew the way she knew that the left shin guard went on before the right, from a system of perception he didn't fully have access to and had stopped trying to reverse engineer. They walked to where he'd parked and drove home through Friday evening traffic, which was bad in the way that Friday evening midtown traffic is always bad, permanent and geological, a feature of the landscape rather than a temporary condition. Emma did her metrics homework in the passenger seat, converting things he named into the other measurement system, and he named increasingly obscure things to give her harder numbers to work with, and she complained about this and did them anyway. December arrived. The trial of Caro, Webb, and Seller was scheduled for January. The cooperation agreement meant Seller would likely see reduced charges, which was the part of the legal system that felt worst to the people who'd been in that restaurant and best to the prosecutors who needed his testimony. Ruiz called Damien in mid-December to walk him through what his role as a witness would involve, and to say, in the careful way of someone who had seen this part of the process go many different ways, that he should prepare himself for the experience of watching a legal proceeding reinterpret an event he'd been inside of. "It's going to feel wrong sometimes," Ruiz said. "Not factually wrong, just shaped wrong. Legal language does that." "I've given testimony before," Damien said. "Military tribunals are different." "Not that different." Ruiz made the sound of a man who wasn't going to argue. "You'll be fine. I'm just flagging it." "I know. I appreciate it." The other legal proceeding, the civil case against the private equity firm whose executives had hired Caro, moved on a separate, slower track, as civil cases do, and Kingsley Global's legal team handled the aspects that were Kingsley Global's to handle. Aurora was deposed in early December in a session that lasted 4 hours, and she came back to the office afterward with the contained, flat-eyed expression of someone who has spent 4 hours being asked questions by people whose job is to find the places where your language is imprecise, and has answered all of them accurately, but has found the process exactly as enjoyable as that description suggests. Damien was in the building that day, and he saw her come off the elevator, and he didn't say anything about it, which was the right call, and she went to her office and closed the door, and he went back to the threat assessment revision he'd been working on with Sasha, and 2 hours later, Aurora came out and was the version of herself that operated in the world again, and life continued. He thought sometimes about what it cost her to operate the way she did, the consistent, relentless performance of certainty and control that her position required. He'd spent years in a world that also required that performance, and he knew what the inside of it felt like, and he knew that the inside and the outside looked nothing alike. The outside looked like confidence. The inside felt like a calculation you were always one variable away from getting wrong. The difference was that he'd had Claire for a while, who had known the inside of it and had held that knowledge quietly and without using it against him. He'd had that, and losing it had not diminished how much it had mattered, which was the part he'd never fully found words for. That grief and gratitude were not opposites, that you could miss something devastatingly, and still know that having had it was worth the cost of losing it. Aurora didn't have that. Not yet. Maybe not ever, in the same way. But the version of her he was watching in December was different from the version he'd seen across a restaurant floor in October, and the difference was not small. Emma's birthday fell on a Thursday. He'd taken the day off. All of it, both jobs, everything. He picked her up from school at 3 and took her to a movie she'd chosen 3 weeks in advance with the decisiveness of someone who had done their research. And then they went to dinner at a pizza place in the neighborhood that had been there since before he'd moved to Queens and had the specific perfect consistency of a place that had stopped trying to improve because it had found the thing it was and stayed there. Emma ate 3 slices and told him in detail about the movie, including the parts he'd been present for, which was a habit of hers he'd stopped having opinions about. He'd gotten her 2 things: a new pair of soccer cleats she'd needed since September because the old ones had finally given up in November, and a book, a thick one, the kind meant for older readers that he'd vetted with Ms. Okonkwo to make sure it was the right level, a story about a girl who crossed an ocean alone and found something she hadn't known she was looking for. He'd read the first 3 chapters himself before wrapping it. She opened the cleats first because she'd guessed them and wanted to confirm. She opened the book second and turned it over and read the back and then looked at him. Ms. Okonkwo told you about this. She mentioned you'd like it. You talked to my teacher about my birthday. I consulted a professional. Emma's expression moved through several phases: consideration, amusement, a kind of affection she expressed mainly through not expressing it. Thanks, Dad, she said. And it wasn't the thanks of a kid performing gratitude, it was the simple, complete thing. He took a breath. I want to tell you something. She put the book down and looked at him across the pizza table with the full attention she gave things that she understood mattered. Your mom would have been... He stopped, not because the words weren't there, but because he wanted to get them right. She would have been so proud of you, not because of anything particular you did, just who you are, how you think, the way you're fair with people. He looked at his daughter's face, which held his gaze with a steadiness that still sometimes caught him off guard, even after 9 years. I tell you things about her sometimes. Not enough. I'm going to do better at that. Emma was quiet for a moment. I know she would be, she said. I think about it sometimes. What she'd say about stuff. What do you imagine she'd say? Emma considered this seriously. She'd probably tell me to brush my hair more. And she'd have opinions about the shin guards. A pause. And she'd like that you found something good to do again. The Kingsley thing. She'd like that you're using the stuff you know. He looked at his daughter for a long moment. Yeah, he said. She would. She'd also like Aurora, Emma said, with the certainty of someone who had given this thought and reached a conclusion. They're different, but they'd get each other. He didn't ask what she meant by that. He thought he understood. They went home and Emma fell asleep with the new book open on her chest, and he took it gently and put the bookmark in and turned off her light and stood in her doorway for a moment the way he always did, listening to her breathe, the same simple ritual he'd had since she was 3 days old, and he'd first understood what it meant to have something in the world that mattered more than his own continuity. Claire had said once, near the end, when the honest conversations had become the only kind they had time for, that she wasn't afraid for Emma. You've got it, she'd said, which was 3 words that had carried him further than she probably knew. He told her that he wasn't sure he did, that he'd been trained for things that didn't translate, that he didn't know how to be the whole thing Emma needed. And Claire had looked at him the way she'd always looked at him when he was being wrong about himself. With patience, with precision, with the specific love of someone who knew both your limitations and what you were capable of, and had decided the second thing was more important. You'll figure it out, she'd said. You always do. Just don't stop paying attention. He'd been paying attention for 6 years. He was still paying attention. He went to bed and slept the way he slept best now. Not perfectly, not without the occasional jolt of awareness that had been engineered into him years ago and would never fully uninstall, but well enough. And without the weight on his chest that had been there for a long time after Claire died, the specific heaviness of a life that has been reduced to its minimum requirements and is trying to remember how to want more. It was lighter now. Not gone. Lighter. The scholarship was announced on a Wednesday in January. Aurora had been working on the structure of it since November. He knew this because Priya had mentioned it in passing and because he'd seen the early documentation moving through the executive floor as a project that was not quite finished yet. The Cole Family Foundation for Single-Parent Households was the working name, which Damien had objected to with enough conviction that the name had been changed 3 times before landing on something he found acceptable, which was the Kingsley Cole Educational Initiative, and which he still thought was too formal, but had decided was less important than the substance of it. It provided full scholarships to four-year universities for children of single parents who met specific income criteria, with preference given to families where the parent had served in the military or in public safety. First cohort was 12 recipients. Aurora intended to expand to 30 by the second year. She announced it at a company-wide meeting in the Kingsley Global Main Conference Room, with Damien standing at the back because he'd been told to be there and had come, but it had also been clear that he wasn't presenting anything or speaking into a microphone. She said what needed to be said about the initiative, about why it existed, and about what she hoped it would eventually become. And she said it in the plain, efficient language she used when she was saying something she actually meant rather than something that had been refined for an audience. She didn't describe the restaurant. She didn't invoke the specifics of what had happened in October or use it as a narrative device to explain the initiative. He'd asked her not to, and she hadn't. What she said instead was that the initiative came out of a recognition that the metrics we use to measure potential are incomplete, and that people who have built their lives around service and sacrifice often exist in a blind spot created by those incomplete metrics, and that the purpose of the fund was to help correct for that blind spot in the specific place where it most directly affects the next generation. She said this, and then she said that the initiative was named jointly because it had been a joint realization, and she looked across the room at Damien, and he gave her a small nod, which was the version of acknowledgement he was willing to offer in a room of 300 people, and she returned it. Afterward, in the corridor, Marcus appeared beside him. "How do you feel about all that?" Marcus said, which was not a thing Marcus usually asked. "Fine," Damien said. "Fine, like actually fine, or fine like you're processing." He looked at Marcus. "Both." Marcus nodded. "The initiative's good. Real good. Not PR good." He put his hands in his jacket pockets. "I know a guy who would have qualified for that when he was 18. Didn't go to college because the money wasn't there. Spent 8 years in the army instead. Turned out okay, but it was..." He shook his head slightly. "It could have been different, should have been different." Damien thought about that. He thought about all the versions of people that exist in the gap between what they're capable of and what circumstances allow. He thought about how much of what he was had come from the Navy, which had been both the making of him and the source of the cost he'd paid, and whether the math of that was something that could be calculated in a way that came out clean. And he didn't think it could. "Yeah," he said. "For what it's worth," Marcus said. "You've changed how this place operates. Not just the security stuff, the way you talk about problems. People notice. People notice everything. Most of it doesn't matter." "This matters." Marcus said it straightforwardly, without sentimentality. "I've watched this company for 8 months. I know what it was before and I know what it's becoming. You're part of that." Damien didn't respond right away. He'd never been good at receiving that kind of thing, not because he was falsely modest, but because he genuinely didn't know what to do with it. He'd spent so many years in contexts where the work spoke and the person doing it was secondary to the mission that the idea of being credited for a change in something as diffuse as culture felt like being given a medal for a weather pattern. "I'm just doing the job," he said. "I know," Marcus said. "That's the thing. You're just doing the job, and it turns out that's rarer than it should be." The trial began in late January and lasted 11 days. Damien testified on day 4. He sat in the witness box in a courtroom that smelled of old wood and institutional cleaning product and answered questions for 3 hours from the prosecution and 45 minutes from the defense, which attempted with limited success to characterize his actions as excessive and found that characterization difficult to sustain in the face of the physical evidence, the surviving witness accounts, and the defendant's own record, which was not the record of a man who'd been reacting to disproportionate force. I was calm on the stand in the way he was calm most places. Not performing calm, just actually experiencing it, which was its own kind of unusual that the defense had apparently not anticipated. They'd expected a military background to produce either brittle rigidity or barely contained aggression. He was neither. He answered what was asked with precision and didn't embellish and didn't hedge. And after 45 minutes, the defense attorney sat down with the expression of someone who had hit a wall and had decided the wall wasn't worth continuing to hit. Ruiz found him in the corridor afterward. "Told you it would feel shaped wrong," he said. "It wasn't too bad." "You did well." Ruiz said it simply. "Your daughter know you were testifying today?" "She knew. She asked about it? She asked if I was nervous." He paused. "I told her a little." Ruiz nodded. What'd she say? He looked at the detective for a moment. She said that was fine, that brave people can be a little nervous. Ruiz was quiet for a moment. Smart kid. She's been working on that theory for a while. The verdicts came in March. Caro and Webb were convicted on all charges. Seller received a reduced sentence as the terms of his cooperation agreement specified, which produced the particular discomfort that reduced sentences produce in people who understand why they exist and still don't fully like them. The two private equity executives each received separate verdicts in a later proceeding, the details of which were in every financial publication for a week, and which Aurora refused to comment on publicly beyond a statement of 3 sentences that said what needed to be said. The night the verdicts came in, Damien was at the kitchen table when his phone showed a text from Aurora. It said, "Done." He wrote back, "Yeah." A minute passed, then, "You okay?" He thought about the question. He thought about what okay meant, not the social version of it, the real version, the one you ask when you actually want to know. He typed, "Ask me in a week. You?" She wrote back, "Same." He put the phone down and went to check on Emma, who was asleep, and stood in her doorway in the dark and did the thing he always did there. Just listened, just confirmed, just stayed for a moment in the simplest version of what his life was made of. Spring came to Queens the way it always did. Reluctant and then sudden, like the city had been arguing with itself about whether to commit and then committed all at once. The trees on his street went from bare to flowering over the course of about a week in April, which was too fast to be dignified but was very spring in a city that didn't have time for gradual transitions. Emma was in soccer season and had moved up to a harder division because her coach had decided she was ready, which Emma accepted as her due, and which made Damien quietly proud in the way he was always quietly proud of her. Not loudly, not performed, just there, constant as weather. He went to every game he could make. Marcus had covered a Friday shift once so Damien could get to an early game, which was a thing Marcus had offered without being asked, and which Damien had accepted without making it a larger moment than it was, because that was how they'd both learned to operate. Aurora came to one game in May. She'd actually asked, whether it would be appropriate, which was the kind of question she was getting better at, recognizing the places where her assumptions about access needed to be checked against someone else's reality. He'd said yes, and she'd come in jeans and a jacket that was clearly expensive but understated, and she'd stood on the sideline next to Mrs. Petrakis, who had taken one look at her and said, "You're Aurora." And Aurora had said, "You're Mrs. Petrakis." And Mrs. Petrakis had said, "I've been feeding this family for 3 years." And Aurora had said, "I know. Damien told me about the spanakopita." And Mrs. Petrakis had decided on the spot that this was a person worth knowing, which was not a decision she made quickly or lightly. Emma scored once and assisted twice, and after the game ran over without checking who was watching and reported the game statistics to her father the way she always did, and then noticed Aurora and said, "You came. You said it was an important game." "All games are important," Emma said, which was the position of a serious soccer player, and then accepted a granola bar from Priya, who had appeared behind Aurora, and went back to her team. On the walk back to the parking area, Aurora fell into step beside Damien, and they walked the way people walk when they've passed the stage of deciding what they are to each other and are simply being it. Not dramatic, not announced, just present. "She's remarkable," Aurora said. "She's 9 and she has opinions about everything," he said. "Yeah, that's what I mean." He looked sideways at her. She was looking at the field where the teams were dispersing, kids finding their parents, the comfortable post-game noise of a Saturday afternoon. She looked, he searched for the word and found it, settled. Less like someone performing ease and more like someone experiencing it, which was different in ways that mattered. "How are you doing?" he asked. The real version of it. She considered. This was a thing she'd gotten better at, sitting with questions before answering them instead of producing answers quickly, which had been her default and which speed had made efficient and sometimes wrong. "I'm better," she said. "Not fixed, better. Better's enough." "Is it?" "Better means the direction's right. Fixed is a different thing, maybe a myth." She was quiet for a moment. "You've thought about this?" "I've had time." She looked at him. The afternoon light was at that late spring angle that made everything look more considered than usual, more deliberate. "I think about what would have happened if you hadn't been there," she said. Not in a catastrophizing way, just, I think about it. What the night becomes without the man in the corner booth. Different night, he said. Different everything. She paused. I'm glad you were there, Damien. Not because you saved my life, although that too. Because of what came after. Because of what I understood after. She said it plainly, the way she said the things that were true and not performed. I was operating on a set of assumptions that I'd never questioned because they kept producing results. You broke one of them in about 90 seconds, without trying to, just by existing in that room the way you existed in it. That's not a small thing. He walked for a moment without saying anything. A kid on a bike went past them on the path, too fast, and they both moved slightly, and the kid disappeared around a bend. You changed too, he said. I want to say that because people talk about what you did, the scholarship, the changes to the company, all of it. And they talk about it like it came from guilt or from strategy, and I don't think it came from either. I think you saw something true and you changed because of it, and doing that is harder than anything you did building the company, and I don't think you hear that enough. She was quiet in the way that meant something had landed. Claire would have liked you, he said, which he hadn't planned to say but said because it was true, and because Emma had said it first and she'd been right. She was direct the same way, and she didn't let things be comfortable when they should have been harder. Aurora didn't fill the space that created. She walked beside him and let it be what it was. The name of a woman who mattered, offered in a moment that felt right, held without comment because comment would have been less. That was the thing he'd found, over the year, that he hadn't expected to find. Someone who understood what things needed to be held and what things needed to be said, and knew the difference without being told. That was rarer than impressive. He'd been right about that. The year did what years do. It moved and changed and became the thing it was going to be without much ceremony. The scholarship gave out its first 12 awards in June in a small ceremony that Damien attended and did not speak at, standing at the back again, and watching 12 young people accept something that would change the shape of what was possible for them. He thought about what Marcus had said. The guy he'd known who could have qualified, who hadn't gone to college, who'd turned out okay but differently. And whether differently was a word that covered enough of it, or whether it was a word that flattened something that deserved to stay complex. He thought about his own daughter, who was 9 and opinionated and currently reading a chapter book about a girl who crossed an ocean and who was going to need things in 10 years that he was already, quietly, working toward being able to provide. He thought about the fact that he was working toward something, that the shape of the future had items in it that weren't just getting through the month, which was what it had been for a while, and which was enough when it was all there was, but which was not the same as having more. He thought about a paper birthday crown with plastic gemstones, which was in Emma's room in a box she'd decided to keep things in, the small, significant objects of her life so far. It was in there with a card Claire had written her before she died, which Emma had read many times and which Damien had read once, when Emma had asked him to, and which had said the things a mother says when she knows she won't be there to say them in person. The specific, practical, devastating love of someone trying to give their child everything they can before they go. It was in there with a restaurant receipt that Emma had apparently taken from the table that night, which he'd not known about until she'd shown him in November. For the box, she'd said simply, because it was important. She wasn't wrong. A lot of things had started from that table in the corner, from 2 people eating dinner and the world breaking open around them and the version of things that came after, which was not clean and not perfect and not the life he'd planned for himself at any point in his life, but which was real and full and moving forward. He stood at the back of a room where 12 young people accepted something that would matter, and he thought that if there was a thing worth taking from the year, it was this. The most important decisions don't always feel like decisions. Sometimes they feel like a man rising from a restaurant floor. In the moment something he loves is threatened. Sometimes they feel like a woman going to the floor when someone she doesn't know tells her to. Sometimes they feel like 6 words said honestly. I want to think about it. To someone who deserved the truth of your uncertainty. The decisions that change things are often not grand. They're often barely visible in the moment they're made. They're choices about whether to pay attention or not, whether to act or not, whether to let a thing be what it is, or to look at it hard enough to see what it could become. He'd spent 7 years being trained to make decisions at speed in conditions that most people would not survive. He'd spent 6 more years learning to make smaller, slower decisions in conditions that were harder in different ways. The restaurant had been both at once: the speed and the smallness, the training and the father, the warrior, and the man who just wanted to watch his daughter eat a chocolate dessert in a nice restaurant and call it a birthday. The thing he'd understood finally this year, the thing he'd been circling for longer than he knew, was that those weren't two different people. He'd spent time treating them as separate, keeping the parts of himself partitioned the way you partition things you're not sure are compatible. But they were the same man. They had always been the same man. And the year had been, among other things, about stopping apologizing for all of it at once: the capability and the softness, the quiet and the readiness, the grief and the gratitude, the worn shirt and the building badge. Emma had known this before he did. He drove home from the scholarship ceremony on a June evening with the windows down because the city in early summer had a quality of air that was almost tolerable. And he thought about what came next. The trial was over. The scholarship was launched. The security overhaul was deep into implementation. Emma's cleats were already starting to show wear and would need replacing by fall. Ordinary things. The ordinary weave of a life that was full enough, that the ordinariness was not lack, but accumulation. He thought about a conversation he'd had with Emma the week before, sitting on the fire escape they used in summer. Technically not allowed, technically not enforced, eating popsicles and watching the street below while the evening noise of the neighborhood rose around them. "Dad," Emma had said. "Yeah." "Are you happy?" He'd looked at her. She was eating her popsicle without looking at him, watching something down on the street. A dog on a leash investigating a fire hydrant with the thoroughness of a detective. She wasn't asking to produce a feeling. She was asking because she wanted to know. He thought about it seriously. "Yeah," he said. "I think so, most of the time." "Most of the time is good," she said. "Yeah?" "Yeah, all the time would be weird." She finished her popsicle. "Mom said that. I read it in the card. She said, I hope you're happy most of the time because that's what real happiness is." He looked at his daughter's profile against the light of a June evening, 9 years old, and quoting her mother's wisdom with the casual authority of someone who had absorbed it and made it her own. And he thought that Claire had been right, as she usually was, and that Emma had gotten the best parts of both of them, as he'd always hoped she would, and that most of the time was not a consolation prize. It was the whole thing. He ate the last of his popsicle and let the evening be what it was: warm, imperfect, full of the particular noise of a neighborhood that was alive in all its messy, ordinary, irreplaceable ways. And he held on to nothing and let all of it in. That was enough. That had always been enough. He was just finally able to feel it,